So I managed to pull another set of ears out of those alginate molds, and in trying to save the mold, I did thrash the top of this ear. So for these, I cut the mold apart, as you typically would do with alginate, and they're actually much better casts. However, now we're at the point where, what are we going to do with these casts? We could just stick them right onto our sculpt, which we'll do, but it might be an interesting time to take a little bit of an interlude to discuss concept and design, and using anatomy as a starting point for something that's a little more imaginative or fantasy based or creature based. So let's cue up an ultra sophisticated transition in 3, 2, 1, go. When we want to create imaginary anatomy, I always like to start with the root anatomy and become familiar with what the root anatomy is, whether it's if you're making something that's humanoid or something that's more animal-like, or if it's some hybrid creature. Find some sort of reference as a starting point. So if we're to look at human anatomy for our specific example, you want to look at the structure and the size and the location. So, and not just this typical picture of the ear that we usually look at, but you want to look at the ear from behind, right? The way that these ears stick out from the head, and the fact that they are aligned like this. They're not straight up and down. There's there's this kind of convergence of these lines, and how far away are they turned, right? Like how close to the front do they maybe stick out? And then obviously this anatomy too. You look at the kind of the most basic parts. You don't need to study every single anatomy term, but this is kind of the helix, and I think as it comes down here, it's like the anti-helix. This little nodule here, the tragus. I can tell it's been a while since I studied anatomy. Often refer to this as the lobe. I think the real term is lobule, but we can call it the lobe, and then this fossa in here. Again, those terms aren't the most critical. What's more important is the structure. So we have this kind of fold of skin, and then this deeper area in here, and then this weird little bump kind of in front of the canal that actually goes inside, connects into the skull, and then the lobe. So if we start with that understanding, how are the ears aligned? What's the size? Do they stick up like this? Are they more at a slant? Like, where are they compared to the horizontal and vertical axes? That's a good start. So if we want to make something humanoid, but we want to use more of an animal reference, if you want it close to human, and obviously monkeys and apes are a good place to start, but you can see even with these two examples, quite a bit of difference with this chimp. Essentially it's a very round shape, and sticks out from the side of the head, and the size comparison, right? That's a lot of ear for that little head. Now maybe he'll grow into his ears a little bit, but we still have those basic structures, very similar to the human ear. with the helix and the fossa here, but very round shape. And then on this gorilla, a more oval shape, very similar to the structure of the human ear in terms of the general parts. But look at the size comparison, that tiny little ear on this massive skull. So you could take either one of those as a direction. And while we're here, and since we've been talking about anatomy, look at this fantastic profile. Look at that brow. That is just absolutely incredible. Something else in the animal kingdom that's really quite interesting to look at is bats. Bats and rodents. Very different structure on the external ear, but this shape, we see this quite a bit. This where it gets more pointed. Elves and goblins and whatever else, pretty common to see those shapes. So if we were to look at some kind of elf and goblin examples, right? So really good example here of the general humanoid anatomy, just that little bit of an extension here, just enough so we know that this character is not fully human. And then this one's a little more gnarly down here, a little more goblin-like and a little hairy. It's not quite as pretty as what's happening here. And then obviously one of the most iconic ear structures with Mr. Spock here, kind of old school and new school Spock. Again, really, it's a really simple design where the root of the human ear is largely intact, and then that helix and fossa and antihelix are just exaggerated to create this this shape. You can actually see in this image, you can see the kind of joint where the prosthetic was attached, and then a much more contemporary version. But in terms of design, really smart. This is a very simple extension, alteration, invention, but it's incredibly iconic. You will notice that there's a difference between the original Spock ear with the detached lobe and then the attached lobe here. I'm assuming that's based on the actor's actual lobes. I'm only guessing, though. So if we come back to our original concept direction of staying fairly close to human anatomy and maybe some distortion, some extension, making it a little more imaginary, we can do a few things. We can do some simple Photoshop manipulation. It's a tool that I know some people like to use. So we can just use the transform tool and distort it, just to see what we could do with trying to maintain the most of the original shape, but maybe we just really exaggerate that top end. Maybe it's something that flares out but stays fairly squat. This is pretty quick and dirty photo bashing going on here. But it kind of does the trick. So that's one approach, is using something like Photoshop, or I tend to draw. just draw from scratch. But if you want to use a photo reference to start, you can do that as well. So if maybe we decide that we want to keep some of these attributes in here. We don't really want to commit to this structure, but maybe the ear itself, maybe we're looking more kind of elf-like, not quite as pointy though, and maybe that shape extends. So if we're looking at the overall shape, right, kind of that macro shape, that primary form, it's this kind of bean slash boomerang shape, and then we can imagine that the helix and antihelix really just becomes extended. Not much of this anatomy in here really changes. Maybe that's a little bit extreme. Maybe we can simplify that a bit. Pretty quick and dirty concept drawing, but does the trick. And it has enough reference to human that it's believable, but we've just pushed those forms a little bit. And again, I always find that starting with the human form or whatever the main reference is, and then distorting from there, rather than just trying to jump straight into something from the imagination. So we'll give something like this a go in Monster Clay, built off of our life cast. So I think I'll leave this goblin, orc, elf ear where it's at, but I intentionally sculpted in two different colors of monster clay to show you where the what we call the root or the base anatomy of the human ear, and then the imaginary anatomy, which in this case extends, I think, reasonably, with some reasonable degree of logic, where the forms meld into each other in a logical way, and trying to mimic some of these folds up here in this part of the ear, even though they're imaginary, and then extending the lobe a little bit. And this is very much how practical effects are built. So the original Spock ears were silicone or gel prosthetics that were designed to fit exactly on Leonard Nimoy's ears. That process is still used today, and even in CG, a lot of artists will start with a real ear and then just extend that anatomy so they have the root forms. So I think that's far enough for taking our little diversion into ear casting and then pushing it into some sort of concept. And then just a quick look, if we were to look at this in grayscale, when we see the absence of color, it does seem to blend fairly well as a unified form. So always use reference when you're using humanoid type characters, when you're developing them. Start with the root anatomy and then build the imaginary forms off of that, rather than just starting straight into imagination. For our life-size bust. I'm not interested in pushing it into an orc, so I probably won't go this far in the exaggeration, but I might do something with the ears that I put on that piece to, you know, to beat them up a little bit, or to, you know, bend them over, or take a chunk out, something like that.